As we trace the historical development of tales from Italy to the Grimms and beyond, we'll examine how the tales communicate social ideals and values to their audiences. In the first of the lectures this week, we talked about the Italian tales and their historical context. In the second lecture, I want to turn back to history and shift toward looking at the cultural context of France in the centuries that followed, when these fairy tales surfaced in a new form there. We're going to be talking about what Norbert Elias calls the civilizing process, and his essay is one of your optional readings for this week. The innovation of the Free City Republic allowed for the quite literal rise of a citizen or merchant up to the ruling classes and even the Great Council. During this time period, when the landed nobility who inherited their wealth sometimes found themselves having to ask these merchants for loans, the nobility tried to maintain their moral superiority over this new money, in part by producing works of art that expressed the nobility, depicted the nobility as having moral superiority over the merchant class. But at the same time, the merchants enjoyed stories that poked fun at the hypocrisy of the aristocracy. At their own, the merchants' kind of roughness and their desire to displace or even join the landed nobility as recognized equals. The landed nobility still had something that the newly wealthy wanted, and that was the credibility and the recognition of a noble birth. Well, that was impossible. You're born noble or you're not. But the new rich could obtain the items and imitate the customs and habits of the nobility. This constant competition in marking moral superiority is a key aspect of the civilizing process. And it happened not only in Italy, but also in other places in Europe. For example, when we look at a table setting of the medieval period and the modern day table setting, there are a lot more utensils in the modern civilized setting. In the medieval period, a noble, even a noble, would share their cup and bowl of soup-like dinner with their neighbor, each with their own knife to cut and eat with. Over the period of several hundred years, new silverware was incrementally added to the table setting with specific functions for each piece, the spoon, the fork, and so forth. And as table manners increased in their rigor, so did the conspicuous consumption of the wealthy. They often preferred objects that were naturally exclusive because they were rare or hard to produce, such as porcelain and specific colors or dyes. This made it more difficult for the new rich to imitate them, just as adding more silverware to the table did. This kind of process even stands behind the way the potato came into widespread use in Europe. In the 18th century, Friedrich the Great of Prussia, a German-speaking kingdom that was becoming increasingly powerful, wanted to introduce the South American potato as a staple that was nutritious and easy to grow. But nobody wanted to try it. So he ordered guards to be posted around a field and a rumor to be spread that something very valuable was growing in that field. Of course, that attracted some of the locals to dig it up and see what was so valuable. And soon there were many imitators with the tuber in their own garden, and so it caught on. Something similar happened with the French pharmacist and agronomist Antoine-Augustin Parmentier and King Louis IV. While imprisoned in Russia, Parmentier was fed potato soup, and upon returning, thought that it must have provided a lot of nutrition because he survived, and so he began studying it. He also wanted to spread it among the population and help it overcome its bad reputation. So he asked the king and queen to wear its purple bloom. Did you even know that a potato has a purple flower? And to plant some potatoes in the royal garden. This eventually also attracted thieves and imitators who, like them, wanted to have whatever the royals had in their garden to possess and sell. This process of imitation is matched by ever more conspicuous consumption and rules of behavior. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, Norbert Elias calls this the civilizing process. But that process goes further. It was sped up as some of the problems of food necessity were solved. The study of agriculture by people like Parmentier increased crop yield, which meant that fewer people had to devote their lives to agriculture, to growing food. That meant that they could specialize elsewhere, and the human resources for a growing administration and civil service and a growing economy beyond agriculture began to form the middle class. As food and resources became more plentiful, national professional armies were also initiated, first by Friedrich the Great's father, Friedrich I, with 8,000 men in Prussia, and this standing army allowed Prussia to become a formidable opponent. What it also did was put violence in the hands of the ruler, creating the first initial policing of citizens and reducing the acts of violence among the subjects. So it gave the ruler more control over violence within the state. Alongside the armies, centers of knowledge were founded and funded. Before, knowledge had been mostly concentrated in and controlled by the dominant Catholic Church, mostly in monasteries. But now, sciences and services for the wealthy and future-looking nobility were ardently working out ways to increase their own power and influence and wrest political and economic influence from the Catholic Church. One of the ways of doing this was to found their own independent centers of learning, universities, for instance, and they became the mediators over what was considered knowledge. They acted as gatekeepers in centralizing, standardizing, and solidifying power, which relies on knowledge and often tries to control what is considered true as a way to maintain power. These new centers of knowledge rose around the same time as did Protestantism, and both processes rejected Catholic doctrine that the Church still claimed through much of Europe, and not only Catholic doctrine, but with it also the tithes, that is, the share or produce of products and profits that automatically went to the Church. So they tried to erode the Church's economic power. The new centers of knowledge also produced different categories of civil servants, and labor became further skilled, specialized, and divided. As more and more demands were made on subjects who were acquiring more and more knowledge and skills, there was also more demand for them to exercise restraint and self-discipline. And this development, in turn, supported the transition from a monarchy defined by its king or queen to a nation state defined and run by its population. Laws further reinforced these social patterns and furthered the civilizing process. So what does all this have to do with fairy tales? Fairy tales became one of the didactic tools that were used to help form the young mind toward self-discipline. In another lecture, we'll look at how much the legal code is transmitted through fairy tales, especially in relation to crime and punishment. But for now, we can see that the tales offer models of self-restraint for young people. We'll see this use of tales in those that were adopted by the French court. As we'll see in the next lectures, the tales there became more and more didactic, that is, aimed at teaching people and instilling certain sets of values. That's really different from the Italian stories we've just talked about. Those stories, written down in a place without a monarchy and at a time when anything seemed possible, challenged power and poked fun at the hypocrisy of the royalty.